Going for an anthropogenic golden spike, Crawford Lake, a desperate case. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and today I'd like to talk about something that's been in the news quite a bit recently, about this little lake in Ontario called Crawford Lake, which is supposedly going to be the start of the Anthropocene. Now, this is rather a complicated story because it involves two very different perspectives on Earth's history. One is that of the IUGS, the International Union of Geological Sciences, which looks at very long periods of time and has an extremely deliberate process of evaluating when there were significant changes in Earth's geological history and marking them with what's known as a golden spike in some exemplar location. And the other is the Anthropocene, which really only goes back about 100 years, and it came from the world of meteorology, not from the world of geological sciences. So they're very different viewpoints at work here, but I will show you some of the background that I think is quite relevant to this story because, well, is it really about science or is it about politics? So let's have a look. The Anthropocene is here, and tiny Crawford Lake has been chosen as the global ground zero. Well, it's an exciting article, but it's not exactly true what the headline says. And here's one from the Washington Post. Hidden beneath the surface, digging deep into a humble lake in Canada, scientists found a spot on Earth like no other, and a record that could redefine our history of the planet. And they're talking about Crawford Lake, which is quite a tiny lake. This is rather a beautiful interactive exploration, so I do recommend people have a read of this and the previous item, which is this one in the Canadian Geographic, just to grasp the fuller picture, because I'm just giving you a quick overview. So here in the Washington Post, they're talking about digging into these sediments. Scientists have uncovered a record of more than 1,000 years of history. It shows, perhaps more than any other place on Earth, that humans have transformed the planet's chemistry and climate at a pace never seen before. Well, I think that's a contested statement, but let's go on. And what they're looking for is a place to put the golden spike. So it's not actually gold, it's made of brass, but this is what it would look like if the global standard stratotype section and point were selected to be here at this lake. And we'll read a bit here. Every new phase of Earth's history begins with a golden spike, a spot in the geologic record where proof of a global transformation is perfectly preserved. So that's what they're hoping will be decided about the cores that they get from this lake. And Crawford Lake is quite unique because it has this little pocket at the bottom that not only gathers all these sediments, and I'll let you read the details, but there's also some kind of an oxygen trap that keeps them all from changing. So it's kind of seals them into history. And here's an image of a sample core from Crawford Lake. And it shows here each couplet of dark and light stripes represents mud from a single year. This makes the lake ideal for stratigraphy, a branch of science that reconstructs geologic history from layers in rocks, soils, ice, and mud. So you can see this goes from 2010 down to 1915 here. I think it goes much longer in the example in the video, but again, we're talking here about 1,000 years of history, which sounds like a lot, and a lot of scientists, a team of 75 scientists. If people see that stratigraphers, a conservative bunch of geologists, are willing to put a line on the timescale and call it by the name that recognizes, that admits the role of humans as a causal agency, then that's mammoth. And that was said by Francine McCarthy, a geologist at Brock University, and she was sitting on a bench beside Crawford Lake. And she led the team of about 75 scientists who made the case for the site to win the candidacy. And there are other competitors, by the way. So is this the consensus? Everyone's heard about the 97% consensus. And Nomi Oreskes actually is part of the Anthropocene Working Group, which is a subset of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. She's also author of the most famous consensus study. And you probably remember it from Al Gore's movie, where he said 0 scientists disagreed with anthropogenic global warming. And Pizer reran Oreskes' research and showed actually only 13 explicitly agree with anthropogenic global warming, and most of them had no position whatsoever. So that raises questions about this whole idea of consensus. And if you read the Colby Kosh article in the National Post, it's also very good. He says a few geologists say an Ontario lake marks the human era. Then he says, so what? The Anthropocene Working Group has declared Crawford Lake a marker for geological time, but scientists are not unanimous. And although we wrote this back in 2014, it does give you a look at the challenges and difficulties in the consensus studies, and will give you a clue to what's going on in this story. So why would they want, especially, to have the authority of this group behind Crawford Lake as the starting point for the Anthropocene? Well, because this is the International Union of Geological Sciences, which was founded in 1961 with 121 national members representing over 1 million geoscientists. It's one of the largest scientific organizations in the world. And so you can see that they would love to have the IUGS on board, saying, yes, we've started the Anthropocene, but that's not really what they think there. The International Union of Geological Sciences says we're in the Meghalian, and this was issued in 2018, and they critique a BBC article saying that it makes 3 errors. The Meghalian extends to the present, not to 1950. And a lot of people think 1950 is when the Anthropocene began. So the article shows a misunderstanding of how isotopic ages are expressed. And the article implies that this division was sprung on the community when the proposal was developed by a diverse international working group of Holocene specialists and fully scrutinized by the Quaternary Subcommission, the Commission on Stratigraphy, and the IUGS. And it fails, meaning the BBC article, it fails to mention that the proponents of the Anthropocene have never submitted a formal proposal to the Commission on Stratigraphy for evaluation. Why? So you see what they've done at the International Union of Geological Sciences and also the other subgroups associated with them. They took the Holocene, which is the time period we're in now of about 12,000 years, and they went back and they found some distinctive changes in climatic conditions. And so they put these little golden spikes for each one of them, and the most recent one is in the Meghalian. So this is what they tweeted at the time. No stratigraphic sections have been presented so far by the Anthropocene Working Group to the IUGS Commission on Stratigraphy. The term Anthropocene has more meaning sociologically rather than stratigraphically. Sorry about that stumble there. So it's a sociological term in the view of the 1 million scientists of the IUGS. That doesn't mean that they dispute the fact that humans are affecting climate, but they simply don't see it in the same context as the work that they do. And in fact, going back some time, there's this article discussing the Anthropocene epoch, scientific decision or political statement. So for quite some time, it turns out that advocates for making a designation for the Anthropocene have been advocating for such a designation for some time within the International Union of Geological Sciences and the associated commissions. But as noted, first of all, they'd never submitted a formal proposal, so you can agitate all you want, but if you can't bring forth evidence, nobody's going to buy it. And secondly, they evaluated this quite carefully, and I'm going to walk through some of the statements made in that article, and decided that it just simply wasn't appropriate because they're two different things. I'll show you what I mean. But one of the things we've already touched on, Crawford Lake is said to have 1,000 years of history, but we're talking about 4,000, 8,000, 11,000 millennia of history when we're talking stratigraphy. We're not talking 100 years, 1,000 years. So that in itself is a problem. But let's continue here. So this is what the International Chronostratigraphic Chart looks like. And this is charting different periods in geologic history. These stages or ages are the shorter periods. Then there's the series or epoch. And then there are periods, eras, and eons. So they're all shaped by different factors, geological factors. It's a very detailed work, and they debate these things for a long time. They even actually our co-founder, the late Albert Jacobs, told me when they issued the Meghalian, there were many groups within the IUGS that were still arguing about whether or not that was an appropriate designation, because the effects of these different periods of time must be seen to be global in nature and verifiable. So, and they're trying to standardize these evaluations worldwide. And of course, that's important for all of us humans, governments, and corporations, because this is part of the evaluation of where resources and minerals are found, because they are generally found in different accumulations according to some of the geologic events that have gone on in past history. So it's very important that these are quite accurate and that they're not politicized, that they're actually very much evidence-based. So basically, here's what happened. We're here in the modern warm period, and this graph represents the Holocene, and the Holocene is just this little part here. So what they did is they went through the Holocene and they broke it down into three different ages or stages. And that was the news that came out in 2018. And the three stages are the Greenlandian stage or age, which was 11,700 years ago, before 2000 AD, the North Grippian stage or age, which was 8,236 years ago, before 2000 AD, and the Meghalian stage or age, which was 4,250 years ago, before 2000 AD. Now, they did note here that these designations have no bearing on the Anthropocene, which remains undefined. So they're not making a statement one way or the other. And they have a very, very methodical process. So you can read about this, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy. It's a very detailed process. Evidence has to be brought forward. Numerous people are involved in the evaluation. It goes through a very long evaluation process through different levels of these organizations that are all interconnected. And they have subcommittees, and one of them is the Working Group on the Anthropocene. So these are a number of geologists, geoscientists. I believe they're pretty much self-selected. They believe that this is an important thing to define, and so their job, self-promoted or self-directed, is to find evidence so that they can then convince this subcommission that it's important to identify the Anthropocene. Now, these are some items from that paper that I quoted at the beginning. Should the Anthropocene be approved by the ICS and ratified by the IUGS as an official unit of the ICS International Chronostratigraphic Chart? Well, in contrast to all other units of the ICS chart, the concept of the Anthropocene did not derive from the stratigraphic record. It arose with Paul Crutzen in 2002, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, who suggested that because of a greatly increased human impact on the Earth system, we had entered a new epoch, for which he proposed the term Anthropocene. But that stratigraphic record is negligible, especially with the boundaries set in 1945, as recently proposed by Anthropocene Working Group. So you can read these papers and see what they're talking about. Most of the stratigraphic records mentioned are potential records that might appear in the future. They are based on predictions. And of course, everything so far in the stratigraphic record is based on the past evidence. So the Anthropocene has been considered and rejected at an ICS workshop in 2010. So 13 years ago, the proposal of this fellow was considered at length and rejected unanimously by the ICS voting members, who considered the distinction as unnecessary and obvious. It is of concern that this rejected concept is being followed by the Anthropocene Working Group, and they're still promoting it. So the nature and utility of the Anthropocene as currently popularized is fundamentally different from the chronostratigraphic units that are the charge of the ICS. It is the present and future versus the past. Finally, it must be noted that with 1945 as the beginning, it would be a geological time unit that presently has the duration of one average human lifespan. So let's take a look at that again. One human lifespan versus the Greenlandian, North Grippian, Meghalian. So we've got Greenlandian, 11,700 years, North Grippian, 8,236 years, Meghalian, 4,250 years, and the UN estimate for global average life expectancy is 72.6 years. Somehow, no contest there. So the real problem here is that there's no consensus. The IUGS is a very influential, even though it's rather quiet, organization in the world, but they're just not on board with the Anthropocene designation. And why does that matter? Well, consensus studies proliferated as climate models diverged from reality. So a few years ago, I did a paper about this. And it just crossed my mind. I wonder what happens if we graph when these consensus studies started coming out. Because, for the longest time, there were all kinds of scientific studies coming out about global warming, about the effect of fossil fuel emissions, well, you name it, the effect of water vapor, ocean cycles, all these different papers were coming out, but a lot of them were based on climate models. And at some point, models started diverging from reality. And I wondered, when did all these consensus studies start popping up? Because suddenly there were quite a few of them. And I was thinking, why? It's kind of like, methinks thou dost protest too much, from Shakespeare. It was kind of like, wait a minute, if people already agree on all this, how come you have to keep telling us that everybody agrees? So, of course, what I found is that this red line represents an average of all these spaghetti models. These are computer simulations. And these blue and sort of pinkish, purplish dots and squares represent observations. So the circles are the average of 4 balloon data sets, the squares are 3 satellite data sets, and the diamonds are 3 reanalyses. And you can see here that initially climate models predicted warming, and we saw warming. But then suddenly climate models diverged rather dramatically from the observed evidence, from the temperature data. So you can see that they really diverge and flatten. And there was an El Nino spike here, but you know, temperatures are not matching what the models are doing. And sure enough, look when all these consensus studies started popping up. 2004, Oreskes, that was the famous one, the Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. Oreskes 2007, Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. How do we know we're not wrong? Doran and Zimmerman, 2009, Examining the Scientific Consensus on Climate Change. Anderegg, 2010, Expert Credibility in Climate Change. Lewandowski et al., 2013, NASA faked the moon landing, therefore climate science is a hoax, an anatomy of the motivated rejection of science. And Cook et al., 2013, quantifying the consensus on anthropogenic global warming in the scientific literature. So you can see that the more the evidence shows that the models are wrong, the louder the claims from the consensus community. And another awkward thing about this Meghalian period, it devastated many civilizations because of abrupt cooling, not warming. So that definitely doesn't fit with the narrative, does it? So here's the BBC News story, and this is the critique of that news story by the IUGS. And here's a comment about this abrupt cooling. The middle phase of the Holocene will be referred to as the North Grippian and runs from 8,300 years ago up to the start of the Meghalian. The onset for this age was an abrupt cooling attributed to vast volumes of fresh water from melting glaciers in Canada running into the North Atlantic and disrupting ocean currents. Well, that doesn't fit with the global warming narrative, does it? Now, what happened is just after the Meghalian papers came out, and they got some press, there was another paper that came out, and I'm sure you'll remember it, the most popular climate paper of 2018, called for collective human action to keep global warming from turning Earth into a hothouse, according to media tracking data. The so-called Hothouse Earth paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in August, so it came out a month after the IUGS made their Meghalian announcement, sparked a wave of alarming media coverage. The planet was dangerously close to reaching unstoppable warming. And it was the 5th most talked about of all journal papers last year. And this is what it looked like. I'm just going to have a quick sip of tea here. So it was called Trajectories of the Earth's System in the Anthropocene. So these authors have decided that we are in the Anthropocene, even though a few of them here, let me just see, yes, Colin Summerhays is one of the Anthropocene Working Group scientists. So he knows that the IUGS has not adopted that designation. So this is all about tipping points, really. We explore the risk that self-reinforcing feedbacks could push the Earth system toward a planetary threshold that, if crossed, could prevent stabilization of the climate at intermediate temperature rises and cause continued warming on a hothouse Earth pathway, even as human emissions are reduced. crossing the threshold would lead to a much higher global average temperature than any interglacial in the past 1.2 million years, and to sea level significantly higher than any time in the Holocene. Well, I think this is a curious thing. This was received for review on June 19th, 2018. So that was a month before the Meghalian announcement was made by the IUGS. It was approved for publication on July 6th, and it came out on August 6th, a month later. This is the paper that got all the press around the world. And they had this curious little diagram here that has no scientific or numeric parameters. It's just an illustrative kind of, I don't know, sort of a emotional image, if you like. It's not very scientific because normally in science you have to put numeric parameters. And it kind of looks like a pinball wizard gone mad, you know, like you're at the bowling alley or something, or you're playing pinball, and, you know, here's old Earth barreling down here. Whoops, whoa, human emissions, whoa, it'll send it into hothouse Earth, or you'll score in stabilized Earth. It's a very curious diagram, in my opinion. And stabilized Earth, what are they talking about? Here's a few 100 million years of history, of Earth's history, and you can see first of all that atmospheric CO2 doesn't have any correlation with temperature. And here's the global average temperature. This is determined from looking at all these rocks that these geologists and geoscientists look at. So you can see it has no connection whatsoever to CO2, and this is about where we are today. So it's been way hotter, there's been much more CO2, it's been way cooler, and you know, what are we actually talking about? Stabilized Earth. So when I read trajectories, my view was that it's an advertorial, and particularly because it did go around the world via the media, I felt strongly that it was science as advertorial. That's, you know, part of my background is advertising, so I read it as if it was an advertorial, and you can find this on SSRN if you want to have a read. So some of the things I identified was, is it paid advertising? So even though the articles go through a peer-reviewed process, the authors pay a publication fee to the PNAS. And according to the American Society of Magazine Editors, under the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and U.S. Postal Service regulations, paid statements constitute an advertorial and should be conspicuously marked as such. In the case of Stefan et al., 2018, that's the paper Trajectories, the article falls under a special publication category of perspectives, a category which are written only at the invitation of the editorial board, and which should be balanced and objective, broad enough to be suited to a non-specialist audience. It's unclear whether a perspectives article author also pays a publication fee. Based on available information, one may assume so. So, you know, why is that relevant or important? Because if those parameters are true, then it should have been marked as an advertorial. And secondly, the board of the PNAS invited it. It's an invited contribution. It clearly got a lot of promotion because it was published in the PNAS. I actually haven't looked to see if there is a publication by the IUGS in the PNAS about the Meghalian. But even if there is, I certainly haven't seen it get the distribution that this paper got. And is it misleading? Well, just a bit. It is consequential for the public and policy makers to read the paper's claim, written by a large number of prestigious scientists. The knowledge that human activity now rivals geological forces in influencing the trajectory of the Earth system has important implications for both Earth system science and societal decision-making. When the geological sciences community has publicly stated that no such verdict has been reached and it doesn't even have the term Anthropocene under formal consideration, contrary to the claims of the authors. I also looked at the language. I did just kind of a word count, and this isn't really scientific language. Tipping was used 46 times. Could, which is predictive, was used 45 times. Stabilized Earth was used 30 times. As I just showed you, there has never been a stabilized Earth. Hothouse, 24 times. Cascade, 20 times. Anthropocene, 12. Higher, 11. And might, 7. So these are all predictive and emotive words. Meanwhile, the Anthropocene crowd are getting desperate. The climate catastrophe crowd are desperate because here's the new chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he just finished saying, don't overstate the 1.5 degrees C threat. So he's saying it's not helpful to imply that a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius is an existential threat to humanity, and he calls for a balanced approach to the climate change debate. Well, wouldn't that be refreshing? So that's why, in my view, this going for an anthropogenic golden spike is a desperate case. And if we look and see what constitutes a GSSP, that is the golden spike type of emblematic venue, we'll find that this is where the Meghalian stage is identified. It's in the Mamlu cave in India, and it says that the stalagmite has preserved a very high resolution record of Holocene paleoclimate and paleomonsoon. Intensive oxygen isotope analyses revealed that around 4,200 years before present, there was a mega drought event that devastated many civilizations. A drought, mega drought. So is it going to be kind of a Pyrrhic victory if they find that they're able to somehow convince the ICS and IUGS to adopt the Anthropogenic, the Anthropocene as a title? I kind of think it is, because look, here's the human lifespan, 72.6 years, versus the Meghalian stage of 4,250, this kind of evidence versus this. So we have to remember that science is about inquiry, not compliance. It's not about consensus. It's about inquiry. And fortunately, in my opinion, the IUGS maintains a strong stance on that. I hope that people enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you'll get your tickets and come to our 20th annual climate science event, where we will be talking about important climate policy and climate science issues. Robert Lyman will be our guest on policy matters. He's an energy economist, a longtime contributor to Friends of Science. We have many of his reports online. His topic will be, when will climate policy hit the wall? Like, when will people have had enough? And Dr. Ian Clark, Emeritus Professor from the University of Ottawa, will speak on a reality check on climate and net zero. So our whole theme is to break free from climate tyranny, evidence over ideology. And I think that is relevant to the discussion about Crawford Lake, because no matter if you get headline news in Canadian Geographic or in the Washington Post or any other, the Guardian, the Tyee, any other sort of climate promoting publication, what is the evidence? The evidence of the Anthropocene is perhaps the span of a human life, and that doesn't tell us anything about what the future holds or what other geologic events may take place over the next few thousand years. And so, I think that the IUGS and the ICS are standing quite firmly on the side of science as an evidence-based process and not an ideological one. And it seems to me that the proponents of the Anthropocene in the working group, are more ideologically oriented, have participated in very ideological papers, as I've shown you in this presentation. And, they're not really finding the same kind of evidence-based science that the IUGS is dedicated to. But in closing, that is my opinion based on what I've read. I invite you to go back through all the material presented here, have a read, see what you think. I think it's a desperate case. They're finding that the temperature record is not matching projections, and they're recognizing that there are multi-million-dollar investments in carbon reduction that are unnecessary and that the public no longer want or believe in because it's driving people into heat or eat poverty. And people very clearly see that now. So where once people were quite supportive of many climate policies, now they understand that they have not been well thought out. They've been driven by ideology and not evidence. And in many cases in Europe last year, The Economist had an article that more people died of energy prices, heat or eat poverty last year than of COVID. So, we're not talking about something that's theoretical anymore. It's actually hurting people, these net zero policies. Anyway, I hope you'll come to our event. I thank you for watching this explainer and enjoy reading more about Crawford Lake. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Thanks.